In this section, I just wanted to give you a brief outline of the historical background to the battle and a description of how the battle actually played out historically before we go on to the war game itself. So, in 1898, the state of the world was that most of the European nations had massive colonial empires. One of those European powers, however, was in a state of decline, and that European nation was Spain, which had at one stage had an immense empire throughout the New World, and in the Pacific as well. But during the 19th century, most of that area slowly rebelled and was lost to Spain. The process really started during the Napoleonic Wars when the Peninsular War was taking place and Spain wasn't in a position to protect her colonial empire. And by the end of the 19th century, America was an extremely powerful nation and was looking to expand into the areas where Spain was diminishing. And in particular, there was the island of Cuba, and in the Pacific, there were the Philippines. Now, in Cuba itself, there was an insurgency going on. Spain still theoretically ruled Cuba, but there was an insurgency going on and a great deal of fighting. And the Americans sent a battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to protect its interests in the area, basically, and to protect American citizens on the island. And mysteriously, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor with a great loss of life, and the Americans immediately threw the blame for the explosion onto the Spanish. To this day, there is still controversy over what actually caused the explosion. The Americans, because one of the plates on the ship's side was buckled inwards, the Americans have usually insisted that the explosion was due to an external device such as a mine or some kind of explosive device planted against the ship's side. But the evidence really is in favour of an internal fire in close to one of the ammunition stores. But be that as it may, the ship was destroyed, and a lot of American sailors lost their lives, and there was a great deal of reaction to this in America, and Congress declared war on Spain in April 1898, April the 25th, I believe. Santiago de Cuba is on the south coast of Cuba, underneath or in the middle of the blue circle there. And just before war was declared, the Spanish had assembled a fleet in the Cape Verde Islands, which are a Portuguese possession just to the west of the African coastline. One of the ships, the Vizcaya, had actually been in New York Harbor on a sort of an exchange basis for the USS Maine being in Havana. And that withdrew quite rapidly as it became apparent that war was going to be declared. And 4 ships, 4 armoured cruisers, assembled together in the Cape Verde Islands under the command of Admiral Surveyor. But as soon as war was declared, under the rules of neutrality, the Portuguese asked the Spanish fleet to withdraw, and they sailed across the Atlantic, first of all towards the island of Martinique, which is a French possession. Now, at this point, there's a sort of game of cat and mouse developing, because the Americans are primarily concerned about their eastern seaboard. They see the Spanish fleet as a threat, particularly as they have recently witnessed the Vizcaya in the harbour of New York. So they are busily trying to assemble a fleet to protect the eastern seaboard. So to that end, they order a battleship called the Oregon to leave San Francisco and to sail around to the eastern side of the United States to join the naval commander Admiral Sampson. And there is also another squadron put together under the command of Admiral Schley, which is described as a flying squadron. But at this point, the Americans are thinking primarily defensively, and the Spanish, Admiral Surveyor, would much rather have stayed on the European side of the Atlantic and fought a battle somewhere like the Canaries, obliged the Americans to cross the Atlantic and fight him in a more prepared state. But having been ordered to cross the Atlantic, Admiral Surveyor then finds that he needs to find a port to recoal, and the French refuse him permission to do so in Martinique. So he then sets off for the Dutch possession of Curacao, and the Dutch do allow him to recoal in their port. But this need to recoal and the fact that the Spanish have had to scramble to find a coal supply will have a bearing on the later battle at Santiago. But anyway, the Spanish fleet then sail from Curacao to the port of Santiago de Cuba, so they finally reach a friendly port. And once it becomes apparent that the Spanish fleet doesn't pose the imagined threat to the eastern seaboard, the Americans then begin to act more aggressively and seek to locate the Spanish fleet and destroy it. And Admiral Sampson gets it slightly wrong. He first of all explores Puerto Rico, thinking that the Spanish fleet might have gone there. And then he imagines that the fleet would have made straight for Havana. So he passes across to Havana and still can't find them. But then he learns that the Spanish are in Santiago de Cuba, so he sails his fleet round to the south of the island and blockades the port. So he then has the Spanish fleet trapped inside the harbour. This is a top-down map of the area of Santiago de Cuba's harbour. It's a satellite view taken from Google Earth, and it gives you a very good impression of the narrowness of the harbour mouth, and it's more like a sort of inland lake, really, joined to the sea by a very narrow channel. So Sampson had a very easy job of blockading the port, but equally the Spanish had a very easy task of defending it. Right at the harbour mouth there's an old colonial fortress called the Castillo del Morro, and that is still there to this day. This is the maximum zoom on the satellite imagery that shows the castle there, and that was packed full of cannon that could easily command the harbour mouth. And there was also a minefield spread across the harbour mouth to deter any enemy ships from entering the harbour. Sampson's first thought was to block the harbour entrance to prevent the Spanish fleet from emerging. So he sent in a collier that was the plan was to scuttle it in the harbour mouth and block the shipping channel. That was commanded by an engineering officer called Lieutenant Hobson and was crewed by volunteers. I think there were 8 crew in total, and it just about got past the harbour mouth, but was badly damaged by gunfire and steered off course and sank outside of the shipping channel. And the crew all survived but were taken prisoner, and after the war were repatriated, and they all won the Congressional Medal of Honor for their action. Then in June of 1898, the Americans moved 16,000 troops from Tampa in Florida across to Cuba, and they landed just down the coast to the east of Santiago at a place called Daiquiri and at Guantanamo Bay, and that was the beginning of the US relationship with Guantanamo Bay. And they moved across and fought the famous action on San Juan Hill to the east of Santiago, in which some of Cervera's crew took part as a naval brigade at the action. But immediately consequent upon the American victory at San Juan Hill, Cervera realized that he had to leave the port. If he were to stay in port with his fleet, then the Americans could have captured Santiago and captured the fleet, or sunk it with long-distance artillery fire. So as soon as San Juan Hill had taken place, the Spanish were obliged to attempt to break the American blockade and escape. So Cervera tried his best to achieve an element of surprise. So he chose to try and break out on Sunday the 3rd of July in the morning, and he did still have to get up ahead of steam, which was a bit of a giveaway, starting on the day before. And his aim was really, he had to leave port in line of stern formation because of the narrowness of the harbour mouth, but his intention was to take his flagship, the Infanta Maria Teresa, and head towards the nearest American warship, and to try and distract the gunfire to allow the rest of his fleet to escape westwards. And luckily for him, there were 2 ships missing from the blockade. The USS Massachusetts was recoaling in Guantanamo Bay, and the flagship, the New York, was taking Admiral Sampson to a meeting with the Land Forces Commander, General Shafter. So the Spanish fleet began their breakout at about 9:35 in the morning, starting the Infanta Maria Teresa followed by the Vizcaya, then the Cristobal Colon, then the Almirante Oquendo, and followed up at the rear by the two torpedo vessels Pluton and Furor, and they met a crescent-shaped blockade with the Brooklyn, the Texas, the Iowa, the Oregon, and the Indiana. And to the east, the New York turned round and headed back as swiftly as it could. And the American fleet very rapidly found its range on the Infanta Maria Theresa, which tried to head towards the USS Brooklyn, but took so much damage from American gunfire that engines were crippled, and there were soon a great many fires breaking out on the ship. So, realising the ship was lost, Admiral Surveyor ordered it to beach itself, and many of the crew were killed, but a lot did get off onto land, where they were picked off by Cuban insurgents in the main. And while this was going on, the Vizcaya and the Cristobal Colon tried to pick up speed and head west to escape the enemy gunfire. Ship in line, the Almirante Oquendo, wasn't so fortunate, because just as she emerged, the American fleet were getting up speed and were able to concentrate most of their gunfire onto her. Her fate was the same as the Infanta Maria Theresa, and she beached herself a little bit further up the coast. Pluton and the Furor emerged and suffered a similar fate again. The Pluton was hit by shells from the Indiana, and the New York also joined the battle about this point. The damaged Pluton was able to beach herself, but the Furor was virtually split in two and sank at sea. at this point there were only 2 Spanish vessels left, the Vizcaya and the Cristobal Colon, and the faster American ships gave chase, and the Colon, being slightly faster, overtook the Vizcaya, which slowed down even further as it began to take damage. And the Vizcaya then had no option other than to also run herself aground. So the Cristobal Colon was the last ship, and that was also the fastest of the Spanish ships, and she at one stage seemed to be pulling away, and then slowed down because the quality of her coal deteriorated. This was the coal that she picked up in Curacao. So once again she surrendered, pulled down her flag, and beached herself. And with that the battle came to an end. It had been a decisive victory for the Americans. The Spanish lost all of their 6 vessels, and accounts vary on the number of killed. The Spanish dead, I've seen figures varying between 160 and 353 killed and 1,800 taken prisoner, whereas the Americans lost 1 sailor killed on the USS Brooklyn and 2 wounded. Santiago surrendered to the American forces 2 weeks later, and the war came to an end with a peace treaty signed in December of 1898. So the war had only really lasted 7 months, and the treaty ceded sovereignty of the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific to the US, and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. And the Americans were also allowed a military presence on an independent Cuba, and in 1902 they began to lease the area around Guantanamo Bay, which they've continued to do so to the present day, despite a great deal of acrimony between the US and the communist regime that took over Cuba in 1959. The naval battle of Santiago itself, I think, is a very interesting naval engagement, not least because it took place over a stretch of coastline measuring about 75 miles from the mouth of the harbour to the furthest point along the coast that was reached by the Cristobal Colon. And because the Spanish ships were all beached or sunk in shallow water, a great many of the wrecks are still there to be dived on, and in fact several of them still jut above sea level and can be seen on Google Earth images. The Infanta Maria Teresa and the Cristobal Colon were both thought to be salvageable, but the Americans gave up on trying to salvage the Colon, and it still remains where it was beached. But the Infanta Maria Teresa, the Americans did manage to refloat, and were towing it back to Norfolk Harbour in Virginia when it sank. They had to break it loose from its tow, and it sank on a reef off of the Bahamas. The Almirante Oquendo was grounded close to a place called Juan Gonzalez, and you can see it in the bay quite clearly from satellite images. From above you can make out the shape of the ship and the outline of the forward gun turret jutting out of the water. And on this tilted view, again, you can see the forward gun turret in the centre of the bay there. The Vizcaya grounded at a place called El Asadero, which you can see circled there on the right of the map. You can see the mouth of the Santiago harbour. El Asadero means sawmill, and again, you can just about make out the image of the ship from an overhead satellite view. It's not as easy to spot as the wreck of the Almirante Oquendo, but you can, it's a bit further out to sea, but you can just see it as a pair of circular objects, which are the two gun turrets. If you haven't spotted it already, I'll show you it with a circle outlining the area. So the gun turrets are those two specks in the centre of that blue circle there, and I'll show you a zoomed in view of that, and you'll see it's quite clearly the wreck of the Vizcaya. So there it is, and if you compare it to that previous image of the Almirante Oquendo, you can see that they match perfectly, and they were sister ships, so that's the reason they're identical. As I say, the wreck of the Cristobal Colon is still in situ, but I haven't had any luck trying to identify that from Google Earth images. It may be that the area I'm searching for is not imaged well on the day the satellite went over, because it is an area that's prone to high waves and storm conditions, and some of the sea surface is very wavy on the images of Google when I inspected them, so that might improve in the future. But the ship was reported to come aground close to the mouth of the river Turquino, and I haven't been able to find a river of that name in Cuba, but there's certainly a peak, Turquino mountain. It's the highest mountain on Cuba. There's the peak circled there, and I have found a reference on a diving website to a dive that took place from a place called Maria del Portillo, circled there, which was close to the wreck. And when I zoom in on that particular area, close to this spot here, I have found something that looks vaguely ship-shaped, but I'm not as convinced as I was with the other photographs. There it is, circled there. This is a zoomed in view, so that may be the Colon, I'm not sure. It certainly wasn't a sister ship to the other two, so that would explain why it doesn't look like the other two. And it is quite badly destroyed now by weather conditions and so on, so that could be the remains of it. I don't know, but it's certainly there somewhere in that region. So next up, I intend to wargame the battle using these models that I've purchased from Wartime's Journal, and being a wargame, it will differ from reality in many respects. I'll keep it as accurate as I possibly can in terms of the quality of the ships and the ships' crews and the ships that were present and so on, but I will probably end up changing the tactics on the Spanish side. I won't stick to the way the battle was played out historically, and see what happens, but I'm looking forward to the game, so watch out for that in a future episode. Bye for now.